My name's Marco Steinberg, and I'm a strategic designer based in Helsinki. And I thought today we would venture eastward in Helsinki and talk about Nordic urbanism and Black Lives Matter and whether that matters to us.
And just why he is there is actually because we have later in the week, we are first of all going to take a few of the tracks that are leading and connecting our cities. So we will take the train track and go from Helsinki center to Myyrmäki and also to Aviaporus right tomorrow. And then on Thursday, we will head actually to the direction where Marco is. So we have asked actually Marco to host a bit of session, and he has asked a person there to be discussing these topics with him. So the show is yours.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to everybody online. I'll give a bit of a report, and then I'll invite our guest in for a bit of a conversation. On June 3rd of this year, thousands gathered in downtown Helsinki to demonstrate, showing their support for Black Lives Matters in the US. What recent events have made evident is that COVID has not created social inequality. It has merely shined a light on it. COVID has helped make inequality perhaps more present, more clear and self-evident. And more precisely in the US, it has made systemic inequality and discrimination along race lines most visible. So I'm reporting from the city of Helsinki, purported shining pearl of Nordic values. I'm situated in the Kulosaari metro station, which you can see right here. This is halfway between sort of two coexisting realities. So if you travel 6 minutes east, which would be this way, you will have a population of about 40% immigrant background. And if you travel 6 minutes westwards, so that way, behind me, you will have a Helsinki with about 0% immigration. And if in 2007 you bought an apartment 5 minutes behind me, so west, the value of that apartment would have risen by approximately 40%. If that same year you had bought an apartment in East Helsinki, 6 minutes that way, its value would have risen by about 0%. And I think the COVID picture is equally stark. Data suggests that if you live east, so where apartments have not risen, you are up to 8 times more likely to catch COVID than if you lived 6 minutes that way. So it's clear that the Nordics are not an equal place. Race, ethnic background, and location matter in all the wrong ways. And if we value social equity, why don't we seem to want to talk about these realities in the Nordics? Do we really think that Black Lives Matter is simply a US phenomenon for which we should show sympathy? Or should we in the Nordics be having our own Black Lives Matter? I'm really pleased today. We're joined by a Helsinki community leader, Kamilla Sultanova. Camila, why don't you come over here? And maybe with a few words, you could say a bit about yourself, and let's get started maybe with your experiences on this theme.
Right. Well, hello, everyone. Hi, Marco. Nice to have you. Nice to meet you. I moved here from Denmark and moved here as a spouse. So it's 6 years ago. I work as a consultant on diversity inclusion. I have my own company, and I create new working cultures to make diversity inclusion in Finland possible in higher education, in companies, and also increase political participation and just societal participation of underrepresented groups. And this is something I've done from Denmark, and moving there, realizing how unequal the society treats you because of the color of your hair, because of your origin. I'm Uzbek originally. So that kind of ignited me a way to get involved, be proactive, and create and manage the mental environment and physical environment around. And I think Finland, and as much as Nordics, they have the most amazing structures to increase civic participation. And this is something that I, really capitalize on by increasing social capital exchange across international students, spouses, Finnish multi-ethnic youth. And this is really something that we need to amplify. And I'm super happy to be here today to share this.
Great. You mentioned you've been in Denmark and now you live in Finland. So we're talking about two different, perhaps, Nordic realities. Could you explain a little bit? Because I think abroad we frequently talk about the Nordics as this kind of fairly homogenous set of values. Have you noticed differences in how those countries and communities relate to questions of different and of race and of ethnic background?
Yeah, so we can start by saying that in Denmark, it was hard for me to get a job. So the access to job market is limited, which is equal across the Nordics. We still have bad weather everywhere, and very much like 80 people very much deserve. But on access to jobs and getting that dignity and unlocking opportunities as an immigrant, and I think Danes understood that to prosper and be competitive, they need international and really diverse workforce. And so they don't care about your integration as much as it's your own problem. Be part of a Danish company, to learn a language, to really be able to contribute and just thrive yourself. Where in Finland, I think Finnish employers and the society is really trying to save immigrants, where they just need to empower them and create the participatory structures to say, well, what can we ourselves do? And how can we allow people to start more associations, NGOs, and really be proactive about their own lives? And I think now it's coming up. But from Danish and Nordic Finnish perspective, what is still equal is that there is that protectionist approach to manage immigration, and we're lacking the empowerment narrative.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. And if I reflect on that just a little bit, it seems like the Nordics, and I'm oversimplifying here, but want to do good, but maybe aren't as ready to ask themselves, what does it mean, for example, to be Finnish in this day and age? And I think we were talking about this the other day.
That's right.
And I quite, with no offense to anybody, feel like we're in Finland caught in a kind of 1950s romantic version of what Finnish is, which was this sort of very homogenous, or at least a narrative of very homogenous people, even though the reality wasn't quite there. That moved from country to cities, from farmlands to industrial Finland. And so I think the shift, and maybe push back or bring a different perspective to this, the shift is really to say that this is not about doing good to somebody else, but this is actually about empowering all of us, making, if you want to take a business perspective on this, making Finland more competitive. We have biases in our languages. We were talking about it. We're first generation Finns, second generation Finns, third generation Finns abroad, right? But in Finland, we talk about them first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants, third generation immigrants. So it seems very odd to think in those terms.
I think that we need the new narratives to understand how multiculturalism affects the Finnish society, and that it comes from within the society, because I know a lot of discussions even from my family that, well, Black Lives Matter is not our problem. We don't treat people like that. We don't kill people here in the streets. But if I brought in the magazine to suggest a different narrative. So this is
Sorry, I'm going to put these.
And it's a magazine which was published in 1905. And Yhteishyvä was to promote a collective cooperation for cooperatives, and that was really to connect people in the villages and different communities, rural communities, and also in the cities. And I think the Yhteishyvä, the common good, that can really bring us forward from within, because that is also a perfect example. And cooperatives came from abroad. And the CEO was a young man from Tampere. He was a working class family, 27-year-old guy became a CEO of this. And now we love this magazine. Actually, the topic of this one is Finland is the happiest country in the world, and what is happiness for Finns? So how can we make this article relevant to people in my neighborhood in Rastila, and as much as here in Kulosaari, and that we can engage in these conversations and get that trust and that lived experience that, yes, I have experience of successes, I have experience of trust, that I know that I matter, I have the dignity and access to whatever networks that you have or I have.
Yeah. So you mentioned that we're the sort of happiest city or people or country in the world. I think it prompts a question, who's us and who's part of that equation? We have the great narrative of Finnish education system as being all inclusive and so on. Do you see a gap between the Nordic narrative and the reality of it? And maybe through an experience, can you describe a little bit that?
Yeah, so I was an international student, and I came to Denmark, and then I moved here. I now work with international students in this Helsinki, Vantaa, Espoo University Intercity project. So we're trying to create the feeling of belonging for those students and people who are not necessarily refugees or people who come from different reasons. But for me, my experience was that I felt unneeded in the society and unwelcome until I met some mentors that said, hey, you're okay. And another experience that I in Finland in a language school, and I tend to think that I'm quite a resourceful person, and I got depressed in a Finnish language school because it was so negative and they only promised jobs on really level that I know I could do better. And I got that schooling in Finland, in Denmark, that I was working already.
So would it be fair to say they weren't imagining that you or someone else who perhaps looks a bit different could be a CEO?
No. There is ethnic profiling in career counseling in secondary school. There is ethnic profiling inside, education spheres and language. So I think we should really give better narrative and inspire everyone to be equal presidents or CEOs or anyone.
But these are things that I think we find very hard to talk about. I mean, in the mainstream media, we're not talking about it. Do you see that gap, or do I just have a blind spot?
I think I'm in a bubble of diversity inclusion, and I'm also very lucky to be part of Sitra Lab, create different experimentation processes for all the public stakeholders, businesses, entrepreneurs, societies, and NGOs to really meet and realize that we need different perspectives. But I see on LinkedIn there is much more discussion on this, but how is it picked up in small organizations? That's the question. Do we really see that funding for mentoring? It's still on project basis. So I think we need to realize that, yes, we want to get out of this mess talk. We want to be equal and really deliver suoran asiaan, and then just say, well, let's have, funding for those perspectives that really work, mentoring, volunteering, and participatory approach to solve.
But I think that captures, in a way, my uneasiness with what's happening here in Finland. Is that the rhetoric seems the right kind of rhetoric.
Right.
Our shows of sympathy towards the American colleagues are there, but there isn't, when push comes to shove, the willingness to put leadership and resources in a serious and systemic way to deal with some of these things. And you mentioned we do have, systemic racism, and actually, the data points that I opened this conversation with, I think are inescapable in a certain way. And so the ways we're planning. And many people might say this subway line that we have is great. It creates equality. The flip side of that, it actually helps also fuel inequality, in that we can bring people out of sight of view and have other kinds of lives, and on paper have a red or orange connection, but without the social integration. What would be, we need to close in just a moment, but what would be some of your top line item thoughts about how do we move this? Is this something Black Lives Matter? Is it a Finnish issue or not? And if it is, how do we move it?
So I would say we need to recognize that there is inequality, because we're selling Finland to the world and we're really promoting people to come and stay here. Helsinki Freedom campaign just launched, and we want to make sure those 10 freedoms really lived on. We need to make sure that the inequality is approached from a local narrative that engages people to change their behavior, and we need close the lack of representation and political participation in decision-making corners, and also the lack of, close the lack of who is actually trying to speak on behalf of underrepresented groups.
Yeah. No, that's a great point, and maybe I'll just wrap it up by just pointing to two things. And these, of course, directly and indirectly lead to questions of urbanity, of planning, of where resources are put, what the common good is. So my first sort of quick comment is that during COVID, we had an exit committee, government committee, to come up with an exit plan. And there's no conversation about what that exit is. What are we working towards? Are we working towards a past idea about Finland or a future idea? And 9 people. Ministries and organizations. 65% men, 35% women, 0 people of cultural, ethnic, immigrant background. Okay. So we come to your point, which is who's representing and who has the lived experience.
Exactly.
In
how legitimate is that?
And how legitimate is that? Yeah. And I would say then my closing thought here is that why should we talk about it now? Yes, Black Lives Matter is different in the US because it has a different history. But in Europe, we don't seem to recognize that we have our own systemic systems of sort of racism. And if we don't address it now, do we think it's going to get easier to address them later?
That's
and my
right.
fear is the cost will be higher then.
Yeah, so today is going to be, I think it's during today, this week, there's going to be a discussion, State of Europe racism picture. So there's lots of Twitter hashtags on that and movement. So I think there needs to be a European discussion that also enables Finnish policymakers to open up and engage in really empowerment initiatives, but also inside your Finnish stakeholders. And it's really, if you talk about economy now after COVID, we just need a decent job, promise of job and then you get in participative citizens, engaged citizens from consumers to really citizens.
Absolutely. And before I give it to you, Katja, back in the studio, I would say, if we believe in Finland that we don't have systemic racism, we need to look at the data. Much of the data is not being collected because of, I think, right concerns about privacy and so on. But we need to start collecting the data to make the real picture happen. And then if we do look at the data that's available, we've seen now for quite a long time that when you ask, for example, North Africans about their experience, their lived experience in Europe, Finland is number one in terms of experience of racism. So I think that tells a lot. Katja, back to you.
Thank you so much, Camila and Marco. That's an important opening, and that will definitely inspire us also on later in the week, because indeed one of the main things is, of course, that do we have the tools actually to actually see the whole picture? Do we have the data? Do we have the ways of mapping realities when we look at the cities, also the localities and the different perspectives to that? Do we still have too much a certain domination, which actually doesn't allow us to see the sides of or the points of view that would make it truly inclusive of how we are then developing the cities? So thank you, and we will now say thank you also to East Helsinki, and we will indeed take the metro line later in the week and and hit the ground, and also Camila joining. So thanks to you both guys, and see you later in the week. Bye.
Yep.